and welcome to Crosstalk. I'm Peter Lavelle. Anti-Semitism is nothing new to the world, and it's undeniable that it exists today. However, how should anti-Semitism be defined, and by whom? To discuss the uses and abuses of anti-Semitism, I'm joined by Norman Finkelstein in New York. He's a political scientist and author. In Washington, we go to Jeff Herf. He is a professor of modern European history at the University of Maryland. And in San Francisco, we cross to Charles Small. He is the director of the Yale Initiative for the Interdisciplinary Study of Anti-Semitism. And another member of our Crosstalk team, Yelena Hunger. All right, gentlemen, Crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump anytime you want, and I don't want any filibustering. First, I'd like to go to you, Charles, in San Francisco. We hear a lot about the new anti-Semitism today. What is the new anti-Semitism, and how pervasive is it?
So I would say, in a nutshell, the new anti-Semitism is an amalgamation of the different forms or strands of anti-Semitism historically. There's an element that is religious-based, that comes from the past. There's also anti-Semitism in some places that is still sort of biologically determined, a racist type of anti-Semitism. And I think that the new anti-Semitism really has as its focus the demonization and the delegitimization of Israel. And there's a correlation between the two. I did an article with a colleague, Edward Kaplan, and we interviewed 5,000 Europeans in 10 countries, and there's a very powerful correlation between classical anti-Semitism, i.e. how Jews do in business and whether they integrate or stick to themselves, questions along those lines, the old classical anti-Semitism. And then we did a criteria that we called Israel bashing, extreme views of Israel. Israel's an apartheid state and the like. And we found that people who have very strong views on Israel, that we called Israel bashers in our study, in our criteria, if they answered 5 questions out of 7, we would be considered Israel bashers. Of that population, they're 56% more likely, or 13 times more likely than the average population, to be anti-Semitic in the classical sense as well. So there's a strong correlation between the two, though differences. People who criticize Israel are not necessarily anti-Semitic, but there is a correlation that's off the charts, if you will. Okay,
Norman, if I can go to you, and you're an expert on this. You wrote a book called Beyond Chutzpah on the misuses of anti-Semitism and the abuse of history. Would you agree with what Charles had to say about what anti-Semitism is today and how pervasive it is?
Well, the important facts about the new anti-Semitism, as it's called, is that it's neither new nor does it have anything to do with anti-Semitism. Every time Israel faces a public relations debacle or comes under international pressure to settle the conflict with the Palestinians diplomatically, they allege that there's a new anti-Semitism. So in the 1970s, the head of the Anti-Defamation League, Arnold Forster, he wrote a book. The title was The New Anti-Semitism. In the 1980s, the then head of the Anti-Defamation League, Nathan Perlmutter, he wrote a book called The Real Anti-Semitism, in which he said there was a new anti-Semitism. In the early 2000s, when Israel came under international pressure because of the repression of the Palestinians during the Second Intifada, there was again a whole slew of books entitled The New Anti-Semitism. The head of the ADL now, the Anti-Defamation League, Abraham Foxman, he wrote a book called Never Again, The New Anti-Semitism. And after Israel's massacre in Gaza and the bloodbath in the Mavi Marmara, the Freedom Flotilla, once again we're hearing these claims about a new anti-Semitism, and we're seeing that this vast production of books, many of them running to about 1,000 pages, alleging a new anti-Semitism. The purpose of this is pretty straightforward. First of all, to turn the perpetrator, namely Israel, into the victim of anti-Semitism. And secondly, to discredit all of Israel's critics as being anti-Semitic. So as the very centrist Israeli columnist Yoel Marcus, he put it a few weeks ago in Haaretz newspaper, he said, if patriotism is the last refuge of scoundrels, then anti-Semitism is the last refuge of occupiers. Israel is an occupier, and it uses anti-Semitism in order to discredit critics of the occupation.
Okay, Jeffrey, do you agree with that, that Israel uses anti-Semitism to discredit its enemies, or what it defines as its enemies? Go ahead.
I can't think of a single thing that Norman Finkelstein just said that I think I either agree with or that is true. But rather than respond to what he just said, I'd like to make a point about recent historical scholarship. There has been a shift in the center of gravity of anti-Semitism globally from its historic roots in Europe to the Middle East. The old anti-Semitism was linked to a radicalization of Christianity and was inseparable from European fascism and Nazism. Beginning in the middle of the 20th century, before the State of Israel was founded, during the rise of Nazism and fascism in Europe, a cultural fusion began to take place between conspiracy theories in Europe and an emerging new tradition called Islamism. Not Islam, but Islamism, which interpreted the religion of Islam as an inherently anti-Semitic religion. And this is the new quality of anti-Semitism in the world today, found in the beliefs and actions of organizations such as Hamas, Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, and most importantly, the government of Iran. The essence of the new anti-Semitism is that the State of Israel exists in order to destroy Islam, and that the solution to the Middle East problem is the destruction of the State of Israel. For members of Hamas, the government of Iran, there is no distinction between anti-Zionism and hatred of the Jews, which they parade publicly again and again for all who are willing to read and see.
So, Charles, I mean, I'd like to go back to something what Norman had to say. So, Israel's foreign policy. All right, this is Crosstalk. Jump in, Norman. Go ahead. No. Norman asked to jump in. That's Crosstalk rules. Go ahead, Norman. Go ahead.
I would be happy to answer what Jeff had to say, and I will in a moment. But I would like to put a question to him. Jeff just said that everything I said was not true. So I'd be curious to know if he can cite exactly which statements of mine were not true.
Jeffrey, would you like to reply to
Your
that?
description.
That's to Jeff directly. Go ahead.
May I reply?
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Norman Finkelstein referred to Israel's massacre in Gaza. This is a blatant falsehood. There is no country in the history of the world that attempted to defeat terrorists by sending several 100,000 telephone calls to residents of apartment buildings in an occupied area or an area under attack, warning them of attacks to come. To describe this as a massacre is false. The notion that Israel is the perpetrator here is also something that Norman Finkelstein and others have repeated year after year. There is a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian problem. It is simply a Palestinian state in which Jews can be allowed to live just as Arabs live in Israel. References to various directors of the Anti-Defamation League who referred to the new anti-Semitism doesn't address the material in which they were examining. And so I would ask viewers of Russia Today to simply Google the Hamas Covenant. It's very easy for viewers to do. Google the Hamas Covenant and read it yourself.
All right, Charles wants to jump in San Francisco. It's got to be fair. I've got to be fair. Charles, go ahead. Jump in.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think I would like to go back to Jeffrey's very important points earlier before he addressed Norman's comments, and he was just about to engage in now. I think I would agree with Jeffrey. We should read the Hamas Charter. It's amazing that there's a political social movement coming out of the Iranian regime, not the Iranian people, but this corrupt regime that supports Hamas and Hezbollah and others around the world with this Islamist perspective, not Muslims, not Islam, but radical political Islam, which amazingly, in the name of trying to rid the region of all others, all Jews, all Christians, all gay people, subjugating women, and the like, They use the protocols of the elders of Zion. If it wasn't so serious, the Hamas covenant and some of the statements coming out of the regime would almost be like a Monty Python skit. But it's deadly and it's serious, and the regimes of Iran, Hamas, and Hezbollah are using classical forms of European genocidal anti-Semitism to get credibility on the street. And what's amazing to me is people like Norman Finkelstein and other so-called intellectuals are blaming the victim of this reactionary social movement that I would believe that nobody in their right mind in the West would have anything in common with if you believe in women's rights and equality. Today women
please, let me jump in here, Charles.
It
is 2 against 1 on this panel. So, Norman, I'd like you to reply to what we've heard so far before we go to the break. Go ahead.
Okay, well, Jeff and Charles claim that this is a new phenomenon. In fact, Israel has always alleged that the Arabs and Muslims are Nazis and marching in the footsteps. And Jeff, you really have to let me speak.
We never said that.
Try to be courteous. It's not so difficult. Try to be courteous. It's not so difficult.
Let Norman speak, please.
So
Norman, continue. Norman, please continue.
Okay, I think Peter said there'll be no filibustering. So in 1948, David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, he claimed that the Arabs are marching in the footsteps of Hitler. During the Eichmann trial in the early 1960s, Israel kept linking the Nazis and Hitler to the Arabs and to the Palestinians. In fact, at the time, it was being said that the Mufti of Jerusalem was the mastermind of the final solution. Then we were told that
All right, gentlemen, I'm going to have to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and when we continue, we'll continue our discussion on anti-Semitism. Stay with RT.
Download the official RT application to your iPhone or iPod Touch from the iTunes App Store. Watch RT live on the go. Video on demand. RT's live broadcasts. And RSS feeds now in the palm of your hand. Question more on RT.com.
Life in Russia would be so much brighter if you knew more about someone from first impressions. Meet friends.rt.com.
Welcome back to Crosstalk. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're talking about what some are calling the new anti-Semitism. But before, let's see what Russians think about this issue.
Hatred of Jews. The term anti-Semitism, in fact, denotes all forms of hostility and violence against Jews throughout history. Today, it encompasses social, economic, and political discrimination as well. The Russian Public Opinion Research Center asked citizens what is their attitude towards anti-Semitism. 64% of the respondents condemned that phenomenon, and only 6% support it. But despite the negative attitude towards displays of anti-Semitism and a host of policies to root it out, many today speak about the emergence of new anti-Semitism. Back to you, Peter.
Okay, Norman, I'd like you to finish up your point that we made in the you made in the first part of this program. But also, I'd like to also ask you, as a tail end to that, where does this new anti-Semitism come from, in your opinion? Go ahead, Norman.
Okay, so then we were told that Nasser was Hitler. Then we were told that Saddam Hussein was Hitler. Now we're being told that Ahmadinejad is Hitler, Hamas is Hitler, Hezbollah is Hitler. there's this curious coincidence that whenever Israel or the United States want to launch a war of destruction, a war of death and destruction, a war of aggression, they claim that their adversary in the Arab world is a Hitler or Nazis. Now, Mr. Herf and Mr. Small, they keep pointing to the Hamas Charter, and yes, there are many things in the Hamas Charter that are despicable, just that there are many statements that are made by Israelis that are despicable. So Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, the spiritual leader of the Shas party, which is a member of Netanyahu's
let him finish his point.
coalition.
Let him finish his point. Finish your point.
The head of the spiritual leader of Shas, he calls for the extermination of the Palestinians. He's called for the enslavement of the Goyim, the enslavement of non-Jews. We had Prime Minister Begin who called Palestinians two-legged beasts.
Peter?
We had Prime Minister Yitzhak
Norman,
Shamir
I think you made your point.
He was going to reduce the Palestinians to cockroaches.
You made your point.
Thank you.
Charles, go ahead. And I want to go to Jeff after that. Go ahead, Charles.
Yeah, I think that what's amazing, there's a sort of a relativism, and I'd even say a kind of a paternalistic, colonial type of remnants of racism here. We have to study, as Professor Herf does and others, the ideology of Hamas, of Hezbollah, of the regime, and respect it, and take it very seriously and understand it. It's not just about blaming the victim, and I think there's been a tendency in Western philosophy and historically to blame victims. We used to blame the women who were raped. We used to, as a society, blame them, ask them where they were, what they were doing. If African Americans or other people were marginalized and unemployed, we used to call them lazy. We used to blame them. And now for Mr. Finkelstein to actually blame Israel and the Jewish people for anti-Semitism is unbelievable. He's almost like the Chief Buthelezi of the anti-apartheid movement, who used to say everything was okay in South Africa when we knew it wasn't. There is a radical movement that is afoot, and I'm choosing my words extraordinarily carefully, that is no less than genocidal in its anti-Semitism. And we know from history that anti-Semitism begins with Jews, but it never ends with Jews. Once this hatred is unleashed, they attack this disease of hatred attacks other segments of society. So if you care about women's rights, if you care about the rights of gay people, if you care about the rights of Baha'is and religious pluralism, if you care about the basic notion of citizenship, you need to take this explosion of anti-Semitism in the Middle East seriously, and the human rights community in the West needs to address it urgently.
Okay, Jeffrey, you wanted to make a point responding, I think, to what Norman was saying earlier. Go ahead.
Yes, I'd like to make the following point. Russia is a country with a great tradition of scholarly and intellectual work, and I want to address my remarks to the viewers who consider themselves part of that tradition, the journalists, the scholars, the public citizens. And I want to draw to your attention that in recent years there's been a burst of scholarship by historians in Germany, in the United States, and in Israel that documents the realities of anti-Semitism in the Arab and Palestinian world before 1948, the links between some members of the Arab nationalist movement and the Nazi regime, and the post-war prominence of Haj Amin al-Husseini in the Palestinian movement, a man who participated and supported the Nazi regime during World War II. Now, neither Charles Small nor I have said Ahmadinejad is Hitler or Hamas is Hitler. We have not made such simple comparisons.
Yeah, but Jeff, but do you think that what you write creates...
I've been very patient.
Do you think what you write and Mr. Small write creates anti-Semitism? I don't think that does. But some of the things that the Israeli regime is what Norman is saying can generate that. I think that's what Norman said. I want to put that, I want to be fair.
I'd like to make another point to the Russian viewers.
Go ahead.
To the Russian viewers.
This is to international viewers, Jeff, to the whole world.
It's
okay.
An international view. I'd like to make a point that Nikita Khrushchev made about Stalin in his 1956 secret speech in Moscow. Khrushchev said that Stalin ignored all the warnings that were coming about the impending invasion of the Soviet Union by Nazi Germany. And the lesson that Khrushchev drew, and the lesson that historians of the Nazi regime have drawn, is that one must never underestimate the power of ideological fanaticism. And that's the reality that we're facing today. When people, such as the leaders of Hamas or Iran
I'm very familiar with this tune.
Hezbollah, stop interrupting me.
I'm very familiar with this tune because I heard it. I heard it on the eve of the attack on Iraq.
Mr. Finkelstein, you have interrupted me several times.
Remember, Jeff, we were told that Saddam Hussein, Jeff, you're never letting anyone speak. You remember in 2003
That's
we
not
were
true.
told that Saddam Hussein was Hitler? We were told that anybody who opposed the American attack on Iraq was
Norman,
an
why don't you
appeaser of Hitler, like
why don't you study the ideology of
1930s?
radical Islam?
So now it's the same.
No,
so
but
now
Peter,
it's the same tune all over again. So now
Peter,
we're
may I
being
come in?
told that Ahmadinejad is Hitler. Whenever we're being told that Hezbollah is Hitler. We're being told that everyone Israel wants to attack, or the United States wants to attack.
Okay, Norman, you made your point. Norman, you made your point. Jeff, jump in, and then I want to go to Charles. Go ahead, Jeff.
Again, I want to address myself to the viewers of this program who like to read books. Take a look at not only my work, the work of Robert Wistrich, of Martin Coopers, of Matthias Kunzel, of Esther Webman, of Meyer Litvak, of Bassem Tibi. There is Paul Berman. There is a burst of scholarship and intellectual engagement in recent years that is important. You can agree with it or you can disagree with it, but please do not dismiss it. Look at the evidence. Look at the evidence.
Can we talk about that scholarship now, Peter? I'd like to talk about
Go ahead, Norman. I'm
Wistrich's
sorry,
book.
Charles. Go ahead. Because scholarship was mentioned here.
Okay.
There's a lot of competing scholarship out there. Norman, go ahead.
Okay, so Jeff Herf mentions Robert Wistrich's book. And in fact, Jeff Herf wrote a raving blurb for that book. The book is called Lethal Obsession. Now it happens I purchased a copy of that book. It's about 1,200 pages. And I looked in the index and I noticed that my name, probably I'm the exhibit number 1 of the new anti-Semitism. There are more entries for me in the book than there are for David Duke. There are more entries for me than there are for Adolf Eichmann. There are more entries for me than there are for David Irving. So let's see what Mr. Wistrich has to say about me. The book,
We're dealing with anti-Semitism.
The book that Jeff Herf, the book that Mr. Herf endorsed, because it's the book that you just named. You said Robert Wistrich's book, so let's look at it. He says in the book that I'm a self-hating Jew and I'm a Holocaust denier. Well, this is the book that Jeff mentioned, so let's talk about it. He said I'm a self-hating Jew and a Holocaust denier. Peter, please tell them to let me speak.
Continue, Norman. You were attacked.
You promised no filibustering.
Finish your point, Norman.
Okay, thank you. So he calls me a self-hating Jew and a Holocaust denier. So I want to put this question to Mr. Herf, who gave a raving review for the book, a blurb for the book. I want to put this question to you, Mr. Herf. I wrote 2 books pertaining to the Nazi Holocaust. One of them, A Nation on Trial, co-authored with Ruth Bettina Byrne, was named a notable book of the year by the New York Times Sunday Book Review. The second book, The Holocaust Industry, was showered with praise by the Dean of Holocaust Historians, Raoul Hilberg, who called the book a breakthrough. And he also was very generous in his praise about me as a historian. He said my place in history as a historian is assured. So yes, we are. We're talking about the book that you produced, Mr. Herf. So I want to ask you. So I want to ask you, Jeff. Do you think that Raoul Hilberg is a Holocaust denier?
Okay, that's a question. Jeff answers. No, Norman, let Jeff answer the question, please. Go ahead, Jeff.
A month ago, I delivered the Raoul Hilberg Memorial Lecture at the University of Vermont. It was an honor to do it, and of course, Raoul Hilberg. Thank you. Of course, he's not a Holocaust denier. He was a great historian of the Holocaust. That doesn't mean that I agree with everything that he has to say. I'm glad, very glad, that you brought Robert Wistrich's A Lethal Obsession to the attention of the viewers of Russia Today. It's a very fine book.
Don't change the subject, Jeff. Why do you think Hilberg praised the book?
Can I come in, Peter?
Mr. Lavelle, I'm a serious historian. I'm not used to this kind of nonsense. Robert Wistrich's book deals in a few pages here and there with Mr. Finkelstein. Over 1,200 pages, The book
Yeah,
is
there
a
are 10 pages
remarkable
on the-
assessment. Would you please stop interrupting me? It's a remarkable assessment of the history of anti-Semitism in Europe, its diffusion to the Middle East, and I might add, for Russian viewers, there are several wonderful chapters about Soviet anti-Semitism and the role that the Soviet Union played from the 1960s to the 1980s in spreading anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism around the globe. So it will be of particular interest for viewers of Russia TV all over the world.
All righty,
to take
gentlemen,
a look at
I'm
Wiswich's
afraid we've
chapters
run
on
out
that
of time.
account.
We've really run out of time here. Many thanks to our guests today in New York, Washington, and in San Francisco. And thanks to our international viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, Crosstalk rules.